For 2 years after her husband's death, Isabella Kane's daughter had not laughed once. Not a single time. Isabella had hired 5 nannies, each with credentials that read like academic dissertations. She had brought in 3 child psychologists, 2 of whom had written books on pediatric grief. She had restructured her entire week around Emily's schedule, canceled board trips, left quarterly reviews to her deputy, and still come home to the same silence that greeted her every evening like a physical object in the doorway. The silence had a texture. It was not the quiet of a child at rest. It was the quiet of a child who had decided, at 7 years old, that the world was no longer a place that deserved her voice. Then, one Tuesday morning, Isabella was standing at the glass wall of the operations center on the 14th floor, half watching the security feeds that rotated across the left monitor bank, when she stopped moving entirely. On camera 7, the east service corridor on the ground level, the one that led past the maintenance closets and the loading dock, her daughter was laughing, not a polite smile. Not the reflex expression Emily sometimes produced when adults looked at her too expectantly. This was real. Her head was tilted back. Her shoulders were shaking. Isabella set down her coffee. She walked to the monitor, leaned forward, and pressed the rewind key. She watched it again, then a third time. The man in the frame wore a gray uniform and carried a mop. He was not looking at the camera. He was not looking at Isabella's daughter. He was looking at a small girl in a yellow jacket, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside Emily. Both of them bent over something Isabella could not yet make out. Isabella reached for her keyboard and typed his employee ID into the search field. Daniel Reed. Maintenance staff. Hired 14 months ago. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she pulled up the last 6 weeks of camera 7 footage and began to watch from the beginning. The Kane Group occupied floors 9 through 16 of the Harwick building on Meridian Avenue. And within those 8 floors, Isabella had built something that functioned with the precision of a fine instrument. Quarterly targets were met. Personnel decisions were clean. The company's restructuring over the previous 3 years had been studied in 2 business school case papers and referenced in a profile in a financial journal that Isabella had framed and then taken down again because it felt like bragging. She was 41 years old. She had started the company with her husband, Carter, when she was 29 and he was 32, in a 2-room office above a sandwich shop where the smell of toasted bread came through the vents every morning. Carter had handled operations and she had handled everything else, which is what they both understood without ever saying it directly. It had worked because they were both the kind of people who moved toward problems rather than away from them. Carter had died 26 months ago. A heart condition that no one had caught in time. He was 40 at the time, and in excellent health by every visible measure. And the cardiologist who delivered the news to Isabella in a beige waiting room had looked genuinely stricken, as though the universe had made an error he was embarrassed to explain. Emily had been 5 when it happened. She was now 7.5. In the months after Carter's death, Emily had gone through a normal grief progression, or what the psychologists had described as normal. Regression, clinginess, sleep disruption, a period of asking questions that had no adequate answers. Isabella had answered every question as honestly as she could. She had read the books on childhood loss. She had held Emily through the nights when the crying came. Then, around month 8, Emily had simply stopped. Not the grief, the noise, the asking, the reaching. She became quiet in a way that was qualitatively different from the quiet of a child who had found peace. It was the quiet of a child who had stopped expecting things from the world. She still functioned. She attended the small private school on Fenton Street, completed her work, ate her meals. She was not, by any clinical metric, in crisis, but she did not laugh. She had laughed before. Isabella could remember it, the specific pitch of it. The way Emily's face reorganized itself entirely. When something struck her as funny, she had laughed easily, the way Carter had laughed easily. And it was one of the things Isabella had noticed about him first, back in graduate school, that he laughed without calculation. Now Emily moved through the apartment, and through the office, and through the days like someone navigating a space that was slightly too large for her. Dr. Patricia Holbrook, the third psychologist, had told Isabella in their last session that Emily was protecting herself from further attachment. She had said this gently, with a tissue box positioned at strategic distance on her desk. "She's not broken, Miss Kane. She's just decided that caring is expensive." Isabella had driven home from that appointment and sat in the parking garage for 11 minutes before going upstairs. She had tried everything she could think of within the category of trying. She read stories aloud every evening, even when Emily showed no visible response. She reduced her own working hours to a degree that made her deputy nervous. She took Emily to the coast for a long weekend in October and watched her daughter stand at the water's edge and look at the waves with an expression that was perfectly neutral. The silence had become the condition of their life together. And Isabella, who could redirect the energy of a hostile board meeting with 4 sentences, could not find the angle on it. She had, at some point in the second year, stopped waiting for a breakthrough and started organizing around the silence instead. She had recalibrated her expectations. She had told herself that Emily's version of okay might simply look like this: functional, present, quiet, and that accepting this was not the same as giving up. It was what the psychologists had suggested, in various forms. You cannot force connection. You can only create the conditions for it. What they had not told her was what to do when you had created every condition you could think of and nothing had grown. What you do when the garden is well tended and there is still nothing. She had started watching the security feeds in the mornings not because she expected to see anything, but because it was a form of presence she could maintain while doing 2 other things at once. The monitors ran constantly in the operations center. She had never paid attention to Camera 7 before. Camera 7 had never given her any reason to. Daniel Reed arrived at the Harwick building each weekday at 5:45 inches the morning. He had a routine that he had developed over the 14 months of his employment, and that he followed with the kind of thoroughness that came not from compulsion, but from the fact that routine was the most reliable form of control available to him. He started at the lobby, worked through the ground floor common areas, moved up to the service areas on the intermediate floors, and finished with the office corridors before the building's full staff began arriving at 8. He brought his daughter, Lily, with him every day. This was not the arrangement he had planned. It was the arrangement that had become necessary after the daycare center on Aldrich Street had closed in February, and the waiting list at the replacement center was 6 months long, and the sitter he had been using, an older woman named Margaret, who lived 2 floors below them, had moved to be near her son in another state. Lily was 6 years old. She was small for her age, with hair that Daniel braided every morning with the careful imprecision of a man who had learned to braid hair from instructional videos and then practiced on a doll until he was confident enough to practice on a real child. The braids were slightly uneven. Lily had never mentioned this. She was an exceptionally social child, which Daniel attributed partially to circumstance. When your primary company from age 4 onward is an adult who works in relative silence, you learn to generate your own warmth and distribute it to whoever is nearby. Lily said good morning to the security guard, to the woman at the building management desk, to the maintenance supervisor who sometimes passed through on early inspections. She said it clearly, with eye contact, in a way that some adults found charming and others found slightly disarming, as though they had not expected to be addressed by someone that small. A significant portion of the building's permanent staff ignored her. Not cruelly or not with deliberate cruelness, but with the particular obliviousness of people who have organized the world into categories and who do not recategorize easily. Lily was the janitor's kid. She was present in the building in a way that was tolerated but not exactly acknowledged. She understood this in the intuitive way that children understand the unwritten codes of adult environments, and she responded to it by continuing to say good morning to everyone regardless. Daniel noticed this. He did not comment on it. He had his own relationship with being not quite visible in the spaces he cleaned, and he had decided, some time ago, that the most useful response to invisibility was to do your work very well, and let that be enough. He had been a carpenter before. He had run a small contracting business with a partner, specializing in interior renovations, and it had done well enough for 5 years. Then his wife, Claire, had gotten sick, and the business had required the kind of presence he could no longer give it. And by the time Claire died, 22 months ago, the business was already gone, and he was already in the process of becoming someone with a different set of skills and a significantly different set of expectations. He was not bitter about this. He had examined bitterness, considered it, and decided it was too expensive, given everything else he needed to pay for. This was not a philosophy he had arrived at easily or quickly. It was the conclusion of a long process that he was still, honestly, in the middle of, and there were mornings when he drove to work in the dark and felt the weight of it in a way that required him to sit in the car for a few minutes before he was ready to go inside. Claire had been the one who laughed easily. She had laughed the way Emily had laughed before, with her whole face committed to it. Lily had inherited this. She laughed the same way her mother had laughed, with the same slight tilt of the head, and this was both the greatest gift and the sharpest edge of Daniel's days, that he could see Claire and Lily without warning, in the middle of an ordinary moment, and feel the distance between now and then, like something physical. He had learned not to say this, not because he hid it, Lily knew, in the way children know the things that live in the spaces their parents don't quite fill, but because he had found that naming it too often made it the center of their life in a way that neither of them needed. The grief was there, it was real, and it was permanent, and it was part of the structure now. But it was not the whole structure. He had worked very hard to make sure it was not the whole structure, but he went inside, every morning, with Lily asleep in the back seat, still in her pajamas, still warm, and he would carry her in and set her up in the corner of the service area with a blanket, and her bag of books, and her small collection of drawing supplies, and she would sleep for another hour while he started on the lobby floor. That was the shape of their life. And Daniel had made his peace with it, in the way that you make peace with weather, not by pretending it was what you would have chosen, but by learning to move through it without losing yourself. It happened on the third Tuesday in March. Emily had been at the building since 7:30, because Isabella had an early call with the Singapore office, and the morning nanny, a composed young woman named Diane, was running late, and had texted to say she would be there by 8. Isabella had left Emily in the small room adjacent to her office, that she had equipped with books, art supplies, and a television that Emily never turned on, and she had gone to her call. Emily, at some point between 7:40 and 8, had left the room. She had not gone far. She had followed the corridor to the elevator, taken it to the ground floor because the button for G was easy to find, and she had pressed it before. And then she had walked in the direction that felt quieter. The East Service corridor was indeed quieter, quieter than the lobby, quieter than the management desk, quieter in the particular way that hallways without foot traffic are quiet, which is to say fully and evenly, like a room that has been holding its breath. Lily was sitting in the corridor outside the maintenance supply room, because the supply room had the best light in the morning, the overhead fluorescence being more consistent there than anywhere else on the ground floor, and she was drawing. She was drawing a horse. She was not especially skilled at horses yet, but she drew them constantly, in the way children pursue a subject they love, long before they are good at it. This horse had 4 legs of approximately correct number, and a head that was slightly too large, and an expression that was, given the technical limitations, remarkably serene. Emily appeared at the end of the corridor. Lily looked up. Children have a particular way of perceiving the emotional states of other children that bypasses the mechanisms adults use, which are slower and more heavily mediated by social training. Lily did not think, "This child looks sad and withdrawn, and may have experienced a loss." She thought something simpler and more immediate, which was that this girl looked like she felt the way Lily had felt for a long time after her mother got too sick to get out of bed. She did not say anything. She looked back at her drawing. After a moment, she picked up a second pencil, one of the good ones, the soft leaded kind her father bought her, and set it on the floor midway between herself and the other girl. Not handed it over, set it down, in the middle of the space between them. Emily looked at it. She looked at Lily's drawing. She sat down. It took several minutes before she picked up the pencil. When she did not draw on Lily's page. She found a clean page in the notebook that Lily had pushed, without looking, within her reach, and she drew something small in the corner, a shape that might have been a bird, or might have been something without a name. Daniel was 15 feet away, working the mop in long, even strokes across the corridor floor. He had seen Emily arrive. He had assessed the situation in the way he assessed most situations, which was quietly and without intervening unless intervention was clearly necessary. Two children sitting on a hallway floor drawing was not a situation that required intervention. It was, in fact, a situation that would probably be damaged by it. He kept mopping. After 12 minutes, Emily made a sound. It was not a word. It was not exactly a laugh either. It was something at the edge of both. A small exhalation that came with a movement of her shoulders, in response to something Lily had drawn on her horse's face with the stub of a red pencil. A nose. An extremely large, extremely round, extremely committed nose. Lily looked up at the sound Emily made. She added a second nose, slightly to the left of the first. Emily's shoulders moved again. This time the sound had more shape to it. Daniel moved his mop to the far end of the corridor, where the light was worse, and kept working. The footage from camera 7 covered a field of view that included most of the east corridor's length, angled slightly downward from a bracket above the maintenance room door. The resolution was standard, not high enough to read text on a page, high enough to read body language with clarity. Isabella watched 6 weeks of footage in segments over the course of 2 hours. She found 12 separate mornings in which Emily had come down to the service corridor. The first time, the day she had taken the elevator alone, had clearly been accidental. The second time was less clearly accidental. By the fourth, Emily was arriving before Lily got her drawings set up, and she sat down in the same spot, against the same wall, with the kind of purposefulness that children only show when a place has already become, in some internal way, theirs. The footage showed Daniel Reed moving through the corridor on all 12 mornings. He did not join them. He did not seat himself nearby and attempt conversation. He did not produce activities or make suggestions. He moved through the space the way the mop moved, covering the area without calling attention to itself, pausing occasionally at the edge of the frame to check something on the supply room shelf or adjust the cord of the industrial buffer. On the morning of the 7th visit, Lily had started crying. Isabella almost missed it. The footage was from 3 weeks ago, and she had been fast-forwarding through sections. She went back. The crying had come without visible cause. One moment Lily was drawing, the next she was not, and her hands were in her lap and her head was down. Emily had gone very still beside her, in the way of a child who does not know what to do with someone else's tears, but understands instinctively that doing something wrong would be worse than doing nothing. Daniel had crossed to them without hurrying. He had sat down on the floor, cross-legged, next to Lily, in his gray uniform, on the corridor floor. He had not said anything that the footage could capture. He had put his hand on the back of Lily's head, not patting, just resting, and they had sat like that for a while. All three of them, and then Lily had wiped her face with the sleeve of her yellow jacket, and picked up her pencil again. Isabella watched it twice. Then she watched the section of footage from the 11th morning. The one she had originally seen. The one with the laugh. She had not yet understood, watching it the first time, what had preceded the laugh. She understood it now. Lily had drawn a version of Daniel identifiable by the gray uniform shape and had given him a mop for a hat. Emily had looked at this, and her face had moved through several expressions in rapid sequence, and then the laugh had come out of her like something that had been waiting a long time for permission. Isabella sat back in her chair. She had spent 26 months and a significant portion of her non-work mental energy trying to find the thing that would reach Emily. She had employed professionals. She had researched approaches. She had modified her own behavior in ways she had hoped were invisible and suspected were not. She had done it all with the same methodical competence she brought to everything. Because methodical competence was the primary tool she had, and she had used it as thoroughly as she knew how. The thing that had reached Emily was a 6-year-old with uneven braids and a gift for drawing absurd noses on horses, and the man who had made the space for that to happen was someone whose name Isabella had not known until 40 minutes ago. Human Resources sent Daniel Reed's file to Isabella's inbox within the hour. She read it in the way she read everything, linearly, quickly, noting what was there and what was absent. What was there? 14 months of employment. No disciplinary record. Consistently satisfactory performance reviews written in the brief formulaic language of supervisors who are assessing something they don't think much about. A note from his first month. Punctual, thorough, keeps equipment in good order. Another from month 6. No issues. The most recent, 2 months ago. Reliable. What was absent? Anything that would have told her who he actually was. The file contained the person as a function maintenance staff, ground floor, east and central zones, and said nothing about the person as a fact. She called his supervisor, a man named Roy Simmons who managed the building's facilities team. Daniel Reed, she said. Tell me what you know about him. Roy Simmons paused in the way of someone who had not expected this call, and was recalibrating. He's good, he said finally. Never late. Never complains. Does the job clean? You know, doesn't cut corners. Does he bring his daughter in every day? A shorter pause. He does. I know that's technically against policy. But she stays out of the way. She doesn't cause any. I'm not asking you to address it, Isabella said. I'm asking if you know why. Childcare issue, far as I understand. She's quiet. I've never had a complaint. Isabella thanked him and ended the call. She did not send an investigator. She did not run a background check beyond what HR had already processed at hire. She had, very briefly, considered both of these things and then recognized them as the instincts of someone who had spent so long managing risk that she now applied risk management frameworks to situations that did not require them. What she did instead was go down to the ground floor. She stood at the corner where the lobby transitioned into the east corridor, in a position where she could see without being easily seen. Emily was already there. She had arrived, on her own. With Diane the nanny's knowledge and apparent permission, Isabella would address this later, and she was sitting in her spot against the wall. Lily was beside her. They were working on something together. A large piece of paper that Lily had produced from somewhere, spread across both their laps, with both of them contributing to whatever was accumulating on it. Daniel was at the far end of the corridor, refilling one of the supply carts. He was not watching the girls with the studied inattention of someone who was consciously performing non-intervention. He was simply doing his work, and the girls were simply doing theirs. And the corridor held all of this, without any of it requiring management. A man from the third-floor accounting team came through the corridor, walking briskly toward the loading dock. He passed within 6 feet of the girls without looking at them. He passed Daniel with a nod that was slightly less than a nod, more of a head movement, the minimum social acknowledgement. Daniel returned it without changing his expression. He kept working. Isabella watched for 22 minutes. In that time, Daniel did not approach the girls, did not initiate any interaction with them, did not look in her direction. He finished with the supply cart, moved to the corridor's other end, and began on the floor with methodical, even strokes. Isabella thought, everyone in this building is trying to be noticed by me. This man is not. She was not sure what to do with that observation yet. She filed it. Isabella arranged, through Diane, to be in the supply corridor with Emily and Lily on the following Thursday morning. She framed it to Emily as wanting to see what she had been drawing, which was true, and did not mention the camera footage, which she had decided Emily did not need to know about. She sat on the floor. This required some internal adjustment. She was wearing gray tailored trousers, and the floor was clean, but it was still a corridor floor. But she sat. She looked at the large collaborative drawing from Tuesday, which Lily had folded carefully and stored in her bag, and now produced and spread across the floor for inspection. It was, Isabella could now see, a map, not of anywhere real. A place with mountains that had faces. A river that appeared to flow uphill by design rather than by error. Buildings that looked like they were made of stacked donuts. Who lives here? Isabella asked. We haven't decided yet, Lily said. She said it with the air of someone for whom this was an ongoing creative project with real stakes. Emily said, maybe horses. I said maybe horses that can also be boats. Isabella looked at Emily, who was watching Isabella's face with the specific attention of a child waiting to see whether an adult was going to respond honestly or perform enthusiasm. Horses that can also be boats seems right, Isabella said. Emily's expression shifted by a small but clear amount. Isabella looked at Lily. "How long have you and Emily been friends?" Lily considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. "Since the horse with the noses," she said. "The horse? I drew a horse, and it had a funny nose," and Emily laughed. Isabella nodded slowly. Then, after a moment, "Can I ask you something? When you first saw Emily in the hallway, why did you do what you did?" Putting the pencil down, Lily looked at the map. She picked up a green pencil and added something to one of the mountains, what appeared to be a door. "Because she looked like she didn't want to be talked to," she said, "but she also looked like she didn't want to be alone." Isabella was quiet. "My dad taught me that," Lily continued, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting a household practice. "If someone looks like that, you don't talk. You just stay, and if they want to be closer, they'll come closer. Your dad taught you that, after my mom died." Lily said it with the directness of someone for whom this fact had been integrated, at some point, into the structure of everyday conversation. It was a fact about her life. "I was really sad for a long time, and I didn't want people to talk to me, but I didn't want them to go away either. My dad just stayed. He didn't say stuff. He just stayed." Isabella looked at the door on the mountain. "Is your dad?" She stopped. "Is he okay? Bringing you here every morning, I mean. It's early." Lily thought about this seriously. "He's tired sometimes," she said. "But he says tired is okay." Tired means you did something. The complaint came through the building management office on a Friday. It had been submitted, anonymously, by someone on the 4th floor, and it cited unauthorized personnel in the East Service Corridor and inconsistent enforcement of facility access policies. It was written in the careful language of someone who had consulted the employee handbook before writing it, which meant it was written in a way that required a response. Roy Simmons forwarded it to Isabella with a note that said, "Your call on this one." Isabella read it on her phone while walking between meetings. She thought about Emily in the corridor. She thought about the large drawing with the mountains and the river that flowed uphill. She thought about Lily saying, "If they want to be closer, they'll come closer." She thought about the footage on camera 7 and the 12 mornings, and the way Daniel had sat down on the floor in his gray uniform when Lily was crying, not hurrying, not performing comfort, just sitting. She called Roy Simmons. "Write up a temporary variance on the access policy for maintenance staff bringing family members during early shift hours," she said. "Specifically for the ground floor service areas before 8 a.m. Run it past legal for the liability piece. I'll sign it this afternoon." Roy Simmons was quiet for a moment. "That's going to be a permanent exception if it's in the policy language. I know. Some of the 4th floor people aren't going to." "I know," she said again. She ended the call and kept walking. The 4th floor complaint was followed, over the next 2 weeks, by a more formal objection from 2 members of the building's facilities management board, not Kane Group employees, but representatives of the building's other tenants who paid into a shared operational budget that covered maintenance and common area services. They requested a meeting. Isabella attended the meeting. She listened to the concerns, which were articulated with the civilized vagueness that objections take when the people articulating them know the objection is not quite defensible, but feel it strongly anyway. Children in professional spaces. Liability. Consistency of policy. She said, "The maintenance staff member in question has an unblemished 14-month record. His daughter is 6 and is present for approximately 2 hours in a service area before regular business hours, during which she sits quietly and draws. The policy variance I've implemented introduces no additional liability that your counsel will be able to identify when you ask them to look, which I'm assuming you will. I'm happy to have that conversation when they've reviewed it." The meeting ended without a resolution against the variance. What Isabella did not say in the meeting, because it was not relevant to the policy argument, was that the decision had been made the moment she understood what the corridor had become. It had become a place where something real was happening. She was not going to manage it out of existence, because someone on the fourth floor felt that the presence of a 6-year-old with uneven braids was inconsistent with the building's image. Some things you protect. You don't explain why. You just protect them. She found Daniel Reed in the corridor on a Wednesday morning, 40 minutes before the building filled up. She had not arranged this. She had come down for a reason. She did not fully have a name for something between wanting to say something and needing to see for herself whether the thing she had been watching on camera was real in 3 dimensions. Emily and Lily were not there yet. The corridor was empty except for Daniel, who was replacing a light fixture at the far end with the careful attention of someone who does this kind of work well. Isabella stopped a few feet away. He looked at her with the neutral expression of a man who has learned to wait and see what an interaction requires before configuring himself for it. "I owe you a conversation," she said. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I reviewed the camera footage." She watched for a reaction and didn't see much of one. "I saw what's been happening in here in the mornings." With Emily, Daniel set down the fixture and turned toward her. Not performing attention, just giving it. "She started coming down on her own," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "I didn't." "I know," Isabella said. "I watched it. Lily just does what she does," he said. "She's always been like that. She sees someone who needs company, and she finds a way to offer it without making it a big thing. Where did she learn that?" He was quiet for a moment. "From necessity, mostly." He picked up the fixture again, turned it in his hands. When her mother was sick, Lily was 4 and 5. She learned pretty early that there's a kind of presence you can offer someone that doesn't require them to perform being okay. You're there. You let them know you're there. You don't ask for anything back. Isabella thought about the 5 nannies and the 3 psychologists and the 2 special education consultants, all of them with their credentials and their methods, all of them trained in the frameworks for reaching a child in grief, all of them reaching toward Emily with their expertise, their techniques, their genuine desire to help, and Emily stepping back from every extended hand. She wasn't broken, Isabella said. It came out quieter than she had intended. "No," Daniel said. "She just needed someone to not need anything from her." He looked at her steadily. "That's usually what it is." There was a long pause. The building's ventilation system ran its low, constant note. Somewhere above them, an elevator arrived on the ground floor with a soft chime. "The policy variance," Daniel said. "Roy told me. It was the right thing to do. You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't have to," Isabella said. He nodded once, the nod of someone accepting a fact, without inflating it. Isabella looked at the corridor, the even floors, the consistent light, the walls she had never paid attention to in 14 months of walking past them. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Sure. How do you do this?" She gestured, briefly, at the space around them, the mop, the uniform, the supply carts. "After what you had." "The business, I'm assuming Roy mentioned. After all that, how do you come in here every morning?" And she stopped. She was not forming the question correctly. Daniel looked at the fixture in his hands. "I come in because Lily needs to eat," he said simply. "That part's easy. You do what the situation requires." He set the fixture down again. The harder part was deciding that this he gestured at the corridor, in the same way she had, wasn't a lesser version of something. "It's just what's true right now. I do this job well. I take care of my daughter well. Those are real things. They don't become less real because they don't look the way I thought my life was going to look." Isabella was quiet. "I don't know if that's wisdom or just survival," he added. "Probably both," she thought. Carter would have said almost exactly that. She did not say this. "Thank you," she said instead. "For everything you've done here. Even the things you weren't doing on purpose." He looked at her with the directness of someone who wasn't going to perform modesty either. "Thank your daughter," he said. She did the hard part. That evening, after Emily was in bed, Isabella went back to the camera footage. She had been watching it in segments, oriented by what she was looking for. Evidence, explanation, the mechanics of what had happened. She watched it differently now. She let it run at normal speed, and she watched the corridor as an environment rather than a sequence of events. What she saw, watching it this way, was the shape of Daniel Reed's days. He arrived before 5:45 on most mornings. He moved through the corridor with a consistency that was almost musical, the routes he took, the order in which he addressed the areas, the way he moved around obstacles without changing his rhythm. He was, she realized, very good at this work. Not in a way that called attention to itself. In the way that real competence never does. On the mornings when Lily had been cranky, and there were a few visible in the footage, the ones where Lily's posture had that particular 6-year-old collapse of someone who did not want to be awake, Daniel had managed this without disruption. He had given her extra blanket time. He had produced, from somewhere, a small thermos that she guessed contained warm chocolate. He had braided her hair in the supply room with the same focused care, one slow section at a time. He was, she thought, a very good father. Not a perfect one. There were moments in the footage where his tiredness was visible, where the slant of his shoulders said something about what it cost to be the only adult in the equation, but good in the specific and demanding way that required sustained effort rather than moments of grace. She watched the clip from 7 weeks ago again, the one where Lily had cried. She had thought, watching it the first time, that she understood what she was seeing. A father comforting a daughter. She understood it better now. Lily had not been crying because something had happened that morning. She had been crying in the way that grief works, not in proportion to the present moment, but in response to an accumulation that has no predictable schedule. She had been crying because the memory of her mother had arrived, as it does, without warning and without consideration for the convenience of the moment. And Daniel had not said, "It's okay." He had not said, "Don't cry." He had not offered the standard adult reassurances that are well-intentioned, and that children in the middle of real grief receive as a kind of pressure, the pressure to return to a state that is more comfortable for the adults watching. He had sat down on the floor. He had put his hand on the back of her head. He had waited. And then, when Lily was ready, she had picked up her pencil. Isabella watched this for a long time. The ventilation system ran its low note. The building settled around her. She thought about all the ways she had tried to reach Emily. All of them had been forms of action, arrangements, interventions, modifications. She had treated Emily's grief as a problem with a solution, because that was the framework she had, and the framework had not been wrong. Exactly, it had just been incomplete. She had not understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do is reduce the pressure. Remove the expectation of recovery. Sit down on the floor. She had not known how to do nothing. She had not understood that nothing, done right, was something. It happened on a morning in late April, when the light in the east corridor had changed quality because the season had changed, and there was now more sun reaching the building's eastern face in the early hours. Isabella was there. She had begun coming down in the mornings, not always, not intrusively. Not with the air of someone attending a supervised event. She came the way Lily had initially sat near Emily. At a slight distance, doing something of her own, available without demanding anything. She had brought her tablet and was working through email. She sat against the wall 6 feet from where Emily and Lily were building something with a set of wooden blocks that Lily had added to her morning bag. She was genuinely reading her email. She was not performing reading. The blocks were forming a structure that appeared to be a hybrid of multiple architectural styles, something with towers and a very broad base, and a suspension bridge connecting 2 sections that were clearly the product of negotiation between 2 different aesthetic sensibilities. Emily said, "It needs a moat." Lily stopped. Isabella looked up from her tablet, and then immediately looked back down at it, because this was not the moment to look up. "A moat," Lily said, with the tone of someone for whom this idea was being rapidly evaluated. "But moats have water." "We don't have water." "Blue paper," Emily said. "Torn up." Lily was already reaching into her bag. Daniel, at the far end of the corridor, kept moving his mop in its long, even strokes. He did not turn around. Isabella set her tablet down on her knees and looked at the wall across from her. The wall was plain, institutional. the color of nothing in particular. She looked at it for a while. She heard Lily say, "What do you want the moat for?" And she heard Emily say, after a pause, "To keep the stuff out that shouldn't get in." Lily tore a piece of blue paper into strips, slowly, with the considered care of someone who has decided that this task deserves attention. But then how does the stuff in get out? Another pause. Then, "Emily, there's a bridge, but only some people can use it." "How do you know who?" "You just know," Emily said. "You can tell." Lily considered this. "I think you need a door on the bridge," she said. With a special knock, there was a silence that was not empty. "Okay," Emily said. "Yeah." Isabella felt something move through her chest that she did not try to name. It moved through and kept going. The way things do when you stop trying to hold them. She picked up her tablet. She did not look at Emily. She went back to her email, and the building filled up around them, and the blocks added another level, and the blue paper strips spread across the floor in a scattered approximation of water, and from the far end of the corridor came the steady sound of the mop moving across the floor in its clean, undemonstrative way. 3 months later, on a Friday in July, Isabella was in her office reviewing the quarter's numbers when Diane knocked. "Emily's asking if Lily can come up," Diane said. Isabella looked at the numbers on her screen. They were good numbers. She would come back to them. "Yes," she said. She had changed, over those 3 months, in ways she could not have precisely described to anyone who asked. She had not become a different person. She was still the kind of person who read the numbers carefully, who sat at the head of the table and moved things forward, who got up early and stayed late and considered this the cost of building something real. None of that had softened. What had changed was something smaller and more foundational. She had stopped treating presence as a resource that needed to be deployed strategically. She had started sitting with Emily in the evenings not to facilitate a connection but simply because she was there, and Emily was there, and that was enough of a reason. She had started leaving silences in their conversations, the way Daniel left space in the corridor, not empty, but available. And Emily, who had spent 2 years not wanting to be reached for, had begun, slowly, to close the distance herself. It was not a cure. There was no cure, and Isabella had finally stopped looking for one. There was just the slow, unglamorous work of being present without expectation, repeated every day, until one day the distance was simply less than it had been. She came down to the lobby at noon. Daniel was finishing his morning shift, which had expanded, 2 months ago, to include some afternoon hours as well. A shift change he had requested because it lined up better with Lily's new school schedule, a schedule that existed because the 6-month waiting list had finally resolved. He was at the facilities desk signing out. She asked if Lily could stay for lunch, Isabella said. He looked up. "Lily would like that." "And you?" Isabella asked. Then, more directly, "Do you have somewhere to be?" He looked at her for a moment. Not immediately. They walked to the small cafe on the building's ground floor, which had outdoor seating facing the street, and which Isabella almost never used, because she almost never ate lunch at a table. The cafe was run by a woman named Gloria, who had been there longer than the building's current tenants, and who greeted everyone with the same flat warmth, as though she had decided at some point that she would be equally decent to everyone, and had never revisited the decision. She brought them coffee without being asked. She had brought Isabella coffee every time Isabella had come down in the past 6 weeks, and she did not remark on the fact that Daniel was in his work clothes, because Gloria had also decided, at some point, that this was not a thing worth remarking on. They sat at the table nearest the planter, where they could see through the lobby glass into the space where Emily and Lily were at the facilities desk with Roy Simmons, who was, against all probability, teaching them to use the building's intercom system. They watched the girls. They talked. In the way people talk when they have been watching each other from a careful distance for a long time and have finally decided that the distance has served its purpose. Not about everything. Not about the large things yet, those would come in their own time. Or they wouldn't. They talked about Lily's school, about the quarter that was ending well, about a book Daniel mentioned that he'd been reading at night when Lily was asleep. a history of covered bridges in the northeastern states, which he had found at a used bookshop, and which had no obvious relevance to his life, except that he found the engineering genuinely interesting. The way old problems demanded old solutions, and sometimes the old solutions turned out to be elegant. Isabella had said she might read it when he finished. He had said he would leave it at the facilities desk. Neither of them had made this into more than it was, which was perhaps how you know a thing might become something real. They talked about the corridor map with the river that flowed uphill, which had been tacked to the wall of Isabella's office for 6 weeks. Inside, through the glass, Emily said something to Roy that made him laugh, a full, surprised laugh, the kind that comes out before you can decide whether it's appropriate. Daniel noticed. Isabella noticed. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, "She's got her timing back." Isabella watched her daughter through the glass. Emily's face in that moment was the face Isabella remembered, the one that had been Carter's, the one that reorganized itself completely when something struck her as genuinely funny. "Yeah," Isabella said. The afternoon moved through them both, warm and unhurried. Neither of them said anything about what came next. Some things you don't say, you just let them be there, real and quiet, and not yet named, in the space between two people who have learned, each in their own way and at great cost. That staying is sometimes the whole of it. That being there, without asking for anything back, is sometimes more than enough. It is, sometimes, everything.